For those who are from overseas, we have a custom in our country of acknowledging our First Nations people when we gather in our country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the First Nations people, the traditional custodians of our land, the land on which we are gathered, to acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move to a place of justice and partnership together. And we have also the practice of praying the YCW prayer when we gather for webinars. And so I pray, Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all our strength and all our time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, workshops and offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us forever from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labour's battlefield rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Pat. And now I'd like to welcome Bruce and introduce Bruce Duncan, who's going to present our webinar tonight for this important occasion of the 60th anniversary of Pacem in Terris by John the 23rd. Bruce was ordained a Redemptorist priest in 1971. He studied economics and political science at the University of Sydney so he could pursue his interest in social justice. At that time, while in Sydney, he became one of the founding editors of National Outlook magazine. Later, he was a member of the Melbourne Catholic Commission for Justice, Development and Peace, and also a consultant with Catholic Social Services Victoria. He also taught for many years at Yarra Theological Union and coordinated the program in social justice studies until his retirement in 2021. He was also a founder of the advocacy organisation Social Policy Connections and the Yarra Institute for Religion and Social Policy. So Bruce brings a heap of experience with him, as well as his expertise in the field of Catholic social teaching. So we're really pleased to welcome you tonight to share some of your knowledge with us, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Stefan, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. And it's so good to see so many of you on the screen and behind the screen this evening. It's an extraordinary occasion to be celebrating 60 years, and it's hard to think that it's so long ago since Pacem in Terris came out, because it's been such an important part of our Catholic consciousness. So I'm very happy to be going back through. I've taught this stuff many years, of course, but just to go through my files again and try to bring it together in the current context has been quite interesting. I'm particularly fascinated by the parallels between what John the 23rd was doing and what Pope Francis is doing. And I suppose you also have a sense of, it's like in some ways a repeat of Pope John the 23rd with Pope Francis. And I think just his style, his warm personality, his down-to-earthness, but with a difference that, he's a man, Francis is a man from the third world. John the 23rd was definitely a European, and I don't think he ever lived outside of Europe, but he did live outside Italy. He's in Bulgaria and Turkey, where he was apostolic delegate during the Second World War, and that gave him really vital experience, which I'll advert to shortly. But some other areas, John the parallel with between John the 23rd and Francis is a bit uncanny when we look at the situation in Ukraine now. And you think back with John the 23rd, he was faced with the prospect of a nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. It was a very scary moment. I was too young to have strong memories, but I do recall it. And you younger ones, of course, this will be not in your own experience, but it was a very traumatic moment for the whole world, and everybody was praying that there would be some resolution of this. So the fear of nuclear catastrophe overwhelming us was very real at this time and continued very real for some time after, and then was revived again during the 1980s. So there's that parallel. And the other parallel that I see is with John the 23rd was how he had to overcome very strong opposition within the church, particularly within the Curia itself, the Roman Curia itself, which had become entrenched in a mentality of the fortress church or the siege church under siege by this wicked world all around it. And there were good reasons for that, because they're just coming out of the Second World War, and Europe had been devastated, as we know, the armies sweeping this way and that way several times. So there were millions of refugees, people displaced and living in very dire circumstances. So immediately after the wars, very critical, and particularly until the Marshall Plan kicked in. So this was all part of his experience too. And the point I was going to make with that was in the current situation with Pope Francis, he also is faced with opposition in the church, and extraordinary from some of the high officials calling for his resignation and so on. But there's a wider group in the church than those extreme voices, particularly in the United States, not so much in Australia, very little in Australia, I think, but a real handicap to the work of the church in the constant opposition. So there are certain parallels between what happened then and now, but I want to have a look at John the 23rd himself and the context in which he was speaking, because I think we have a lot to learn, and it's very useful to look at how he did these things. He was elected Pope in October 1958 after the death of Pius XII, who had been the Pope during the Second World War, of course, and had he became a symbol in Catholic mind at that time of endurance in the face of oppression and suffering through the war years. But he wasn't held in great affection. He was a remote figure, a stern figure. I can't remember seeing him, a photo of him smiling. And so when John the 23rd appeared on the scene, he was a different sort of character. People warmed to him straight away. I remember my father saying that my father wasn't a Catholic and was a bit anti-Catholic, if anything, but he liked Pope John the 23rd, and I think a lot of people did that because just the warmth of his humanity, there was some magic in it all that I don't understand, but it communicated something that Francis has too, to some extent. So he was a breath of fresh air after the relief of the difficult years under Pius XII, not only during the Second World War and its aftermath, but the communist persecutions. These, which of course caused a great reaction in the church, and we had mobilized, the sociologists call it reaction formation, that we became under siege in Europe with the communist onslaught. And we even felt that in Australia and throughout the rest of the world as well. And for good reason, because the communists under Lenin and Stalin later on, particularly killed tens of millions of people. And the church, not just the Catholic Church, but it was intent on wiping out all the religious groups, including the Orthodox churches and the Muslim groups as well. All his other Christian groups all suffered, but particularly the Catholic Church, which by the end of the 30s had been almost wiped out entirely from what was then the Soviet Union. It expanded after it defeated the Nazis in the Second World War to take in Eastern Europe, and that created new problems for us. So what developed here was a really strong feeling of anti-communism. We've got to do everything to resist this. The other thing that I want to revert to about Pius XII was it became a very narrow version of what orthodoxy was, what it meant to be a Catholic. And it had to do with this process of reaction formation. And a lot of the new ideas that were coming up through biblical scholarship, historical studies, and theology were suppressed. And many of the leading scholars who emerged later on as the architects of the Second Vatican Council, people like Congar, de Lubeck, Chenou, Rana, were silenced. So this was an astonishing period of reaction, and the church had been ossified in its response to the modern world. And just to give you an indication of how conservative it was, I'm going to read you from Pietro, some words from Pietro Pavan, Monsignor Pietro Pavan. He was the writer, the main drafter of Pacem and Terris. And this is from his book, his 1992 book, Prophet of Our Times. It's written by Franco Biffi, Father Franco Biffi, Biffi, and it was translated by Rosemary Goldie. Some of you will have known Rosemary Goldie. She's an Australian member of the Grail Institute, who in 1951 happened to be in Rome for the Congress of Catholic Action. And she said that the Congress was so chaotic, she just hopped in. She was there to study in France, but she hopped in and helped organize the conference. And Monsignor Pavan, who was running the conference at the time, asked her to stay on, and so she became a secretary to him over time, and was to play a very important part in the lay apostolate movements later in the church, not just in Australia, but internationally. So she was a very important figure. So this Pavan, Rosemary Goldie was very involved and knew very well Pavan's thinking and what was happening in Rome. So, but his Biffi is writing, Pavan's task was not an easy one. Bitter opposition brought him even to the point of tears. We can guess at this from a note written towards the end of the pontificate of Pius XII. And now I quote Pavan, "Many worthy people, old in years and antiquated in ideas, have no sympathy for democracy. They think things would be much better if the opposition was silenced under a prestigious leader with a strong government and an efficient police force, a paternalistic regime that would plan, provide, and administer everything." Well, this is the strong leader that Mussolini had posed as during the fascist period. So there are people who in the church who are still thinking this way. Biffi wrote, of Pavan's conviction about the church that needed to be reconciled with democracy, and his dismay at the intransigent attitudes of the church and the Roman Curia. And Beefy writes, one last reason for the urgency of his task was what he called the quasi-illiteracy or the inveterate prejudice of much of the ecclesiastical world where democracy was concerned. The first step was often to exorcise the terminology, exorcise, cast out the demon, not only from the term democracy, but other terms of which he helped to enrich the language of the church: religious freedom, the secular state, separation of powers, socialization, etc. It was even necessary to exorcise liberty, fraternity, equality, to show that the flag of the French Revolution could be waved to urge Christians on to found economic, social, and political institutions favorable to the integral development of a human person. This is extraordinary thinking of Pavan that is reflected here. But some of you will recognize in this that Frederick Ozanam had been saying these things a century before. You know, there's a long tradition of this trying to grapple and integrate the positive aspects of those social movements that began in the French Revolution. And Beefy, this is another strange thing. Beefy continued, he writes, strangely enough, when the United Nations had actually been created and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated in 1948, Pius XII retreated into enigmatic silence. What an extraordinary thing. So I think what it demonstrates is the disconnect that the church had with all these great social, political, and intellectual currents that were happening at the time. So John the 23rd's got a problem. Just excuse me. He began slowly opening up the church on both the intellectual and social level. So what made him different to the rest of the people around him? Angelo Roncalli, he was born in 1881. He was one of 13 children. He was born into a family of sharecroppers in Bergamo, in the Lombardy region of Italy, and he knew well the life of small farmers. And I presume that this had a big influence on his views that when he came to writing or having drafted Mater et Magistra in 1961, which is particularly interested in small farmers and agriculture. He was ordained in 1904, but from 1905 to 1914, so 9 years, he acted as secretary to Bishop Redini Tedeschi in Bergamo. So that was his first decade, doing pastoral work and helping the bishop. But then in 1914, he was called up into the army. And he served as a military chaplain and a hospital orderly during the war, and wasn't discharged till 1919. So that's over 4 years he was in the army, in uniform, living with the troops or the barracks, and dealing with the wounded and their families and so on. And there was, we don't think much about Italy in the First World War, but there were very bloody battles in the north of Italy with the Austrian armies. And he would have been exposed to all that. So I think this, again, gives him a real conviction about the evils of war, and it helps you, gives him the determination later on to speak out strongly about these issues. He was ordained, he was sent as an apostolic visitor to Bulgaria in 1925. And I think Peter Hebblethwaite mentions elsewhere that Peter Hebblethwaite, I should say, wrote this marvelous book, John the 23rd and the Council. I don't know if you can read that. But I've just been rereading it for this talk this evening and realize what a treasure this book is. If you want to read a book that'll just keep you riveted, this is it. And Hebblethwaite, of course, is one of the best Vatican commentators, and it's one of the best books I've ever read. And I'm going to read it again because it is such a telling thing, and also sheds so much light on what we do, trying to work through at the moment in the church. So anyway, the reason I just distracted myself there. The reason that Roncalli was sent to into Bulgaria in 1925, where he remained for 10 years, is to get him out of Italy, because he was regarded as one of the leading anti-fascists, and I presume that would have created problems for the Vatican. So they kept him out of Italy the whole war, right till the end of the after the war, in 1944, when he was able to return. So from Bulgaria, he then went to do apostolic delegate to Turkey and Greece, where he was based in Istanbul. And during the war years and before that, he was very involved with the Jewish underground refugee network. And this was great exposure to him, because he was when he talks about these sorts of things and writes about them, he's not talking as an intellectual exercise. He's actually experienced and talked with these people in these situations, seen what they're going through. And in addition to that, he's exposed to, in Bulgaria, there are not a lot of Catholics. And in Greece, it's mainly the Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church, of course. So, but it gives them the opportunity to mix around and get to know these different worlds, the world of Islam, or parts of it, and particularly the various versions of the Greek Orthodox, or Greek and Russian Orthodox communion churches as they exist. So he's being exposed in a different way. And in the meantime, he still has time to reflect, and he kept a lot of diaries, of course. And during this, it's a long time to be out of Rome, and not a lot of diplomatic activity happening, perhaps from time to time. But what he does is to write a 5-volume history of Charles Borromeo. Now, why is this important? Because Charles Borromeo was the man who implemented the Council of Trent. And I think, why would we be surprised that he would later on invoke the Second Vatican Council? Because he'd already thought through all these. He'd seen a lot of the things that had arisen in the Council of Trent, what went right, what went wrong, sorts of things that can occur. So, and he later said, no one suggested to him that he invoke a council. It was all his own thought. It surprised everybody at the time. But he said, this idea must have been germinating in his mind for some time beforehand. So, in December 1944, he's made nuncio to France. He's sent to France to investigate bishops who might have been compromised with the Vichy regime or the Nazis. There were dozens of them that were under investigation. Only 4 were removed. But that would have been, broadening him to the experience of what was happening in France and what it meant for the church there. In January 1953, he was made Patriarch of Venice and a cardinal. And interestingly, he held a diocesan synod in 1958. I was surprised to see that. So Roncalli, as I was saying, had been a leading anti-fascist in Italy, along with his close friend, G.B. Montini, who later became Paul VI. They had been both closely aligned, but Montini, since 1944, had been acting secretary for one of the two people looking after the Secretariat of State. He was acting secretary for ordinary affairs, which meant not diplomatic affairs. And Tardini was the secretary for the extraordinary affairs. That means the overseas and diplomatic things. And then Montini was made Archbishop of Milan in 1944. Interesting, Montini had been removed from the Vatican by his opponents, the conservative opponents, because Montini had been very much interested in the new theology which had been emerging, and was protecting a lot of these scholars that were under investigation or being silenced by others in the Vatican. So when he was leaving the Vatican, or leaving his office in the Secretariat of State, the officials there searched all these papers, took them off the trucks and searched them to see if he was smuggling any secret documents out. So it was seemed to be a calculated insult to him from others. So it was a difficult situation that he'd been in. So you can see that Montini and Roncalli, they understood each other and appreciated what had to be done for the renewal of the church. So John the 23rd announces a council on January the 25th, 1959. Everybody was shocked. No one was expecting him. But as a premonition of what might happen, the Roman Synod had been held, or was to be held, the following January, 1960, and it was tightly controlled by the conservative sections of the Curia. It reminded Catholics of the opposition to communism and the need to follow directions in the electoral voting, to vote against the communists in the Italian elections, and the need for the people to defend the church and religion. And initially, John the 23rd said little about these issues. And there was nothing there to indicate that he was going to bring on radical initiatives. The conservative group was headed by Cardinal Taviani in the Holy Office. His favourite motto was "Error has no rights," which means people who were in error didn't have rights, presumably. And Cardinal Siri was president of the Italian Bishops' Conference and of Catholic Action, and Riccardo Lombardi, a Jesuit priest, who based his anti-communism on the premise that communism forms a whole on WHOLE, in which it is impossible to make distinctions between ideology, programs, and tactics. Well, in his famous encyclical Pacem and Terris, of course, John did what Lombardi thought impossible. He made these distinctions. So John was unhappy with the stand of the Italian bishops and wanted to withdraw them out of direct involvement in politics. Meanwhile, the Osservatore Romano had published an article called Punti Fermi. Punti Fermi, there's Here We Stand, I suppose you could translate it, which was the unsigned work of Tardini, who was the Secretary of State, or the other undersecretary, the two undersecretaries, no secretary. Syrian Ottaviani. And this was the integralist, this really extreme group, reaction to Maritain, Jacques Maritain's political thinking, and arguing Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher, who had been caught in France, caught in the United States on a lecture tour when France had fallen to the Germans and the Vichy regime had begun. Maritain became the voice of Free Radio Free Europe, I think it was called, and was making political lectures that were radioed back to France and Europe about the compatibility and about his political ideas. And what Maritain had been working on his whole life's project really was to reconcile Catholic social and political thought with democracy, to wean it away from these extreme right-wing groups, whether it was Action Française under Charles Maurras or the fascists under Mussolini, or the other right-wing groups in Austria or other places. He was trying to say the lay people must be independent from the church in matters in the political sphere, or to make not entirely independent, but to be informed by the Christian values and social teaching, but then to make their own decisions. But anyway, Punti Fermi was against that. It rejected as absurd the distinction between a man's conscience as a Catholic and his conscience as a citizen, and stressed that in every sector of his activity, a Catholic's conduct, public and private, must be motivated by the laws, orientation, and instructions of the hierarchy, and insisted that the church should enter the political field. What was this all about? Well, the Christian Democrats had emerged after the Second World War and were wanting to they, of course, weren't supporting the Communist Party in Italy, but to preserve the democracy, they wanted to go into an alliance with the socialists, the moderate socialists, the Nenni Party. And but the Conservatives regarded this as too left-wing and were denying them, demanding the Catholics do not do that. They held, the Punti Fermi held that the bishops alone could decide the legitimacy of Catholics in the political sphere. And it was not up to the arbitrary decisions of individual Catholics. And it was inconceivable they should decide to be in conflict with the bishops. The hierarchy alone couldn't judge in a particular social and political situation whether the principles of religious and moral orders were involved or threatened. In contrast, John, while this fight was going on, John had said very little about communism. It was in great contrast to what Pius XII had said during those extreme years earlier on. So Aldo Moro, the leader of the Christian Democrats, wrote a long paper defending himself against these charges that he was disloyal to the church, and drawing on the thought of Maritain. For his trouble, Moro was attacked as a heretic and a traitor, and so much so, and in the Catholic papers as well. And he happened to be a close friend of Montini, who was at this time Archbishop of Milan. And so Montini sacked the editor of the Catholic paper in Milan for his attacks on Moro. what happened next was a landmark speech, which Hebblethwaite said became known as the Wider Tiber speech. Wider Tiber, so it made the river in Rome wider, so the church was more separate from the political sphere. John refused to come out and condemn Moro, which was understood as a refusal to back the Punti Fermi line. And this became the background then to the 1961 Mater Magistra encyclical that came out not so long afterwards. And what did this do? Though it continued on some of the work of Pius XII, it roundly endorsed the concept of the welfare state and broadened the discussion of social and economic problems, especially in relation to the developing world. And of course, this is becoming more and more important with the colonial empires having disintegrated or in the process of disintegrating. And significantly, without mentioning communism, he noted the persecution, quote, raging for decades, and the dignified superiority of the persecuted and the refined barbarity of the persecutors. So it wasn't a condemnation, but it recognized the persecution that had been going on. And it called for cooperation between those who did not share common views for the sake of the common good. I want to switch. Well, the Second Vatican Council began on the 11th of October, 1962. And this set the stage for the struggle between the hardline conservatives around Cardinal Ottaviani and the reformers like Montini. And of course, some of you would know Cardinal Leonard of Lille, Joseph Frings of Cologne, and Bishop de Smelt of Bruges. And these are all people that Cardine would have known and helped as well. So despite John's efforts to concentrate the mind of the bishops on social issues, he wanted the church to broaden its horizon to what was happening, I mean, not just in Europe, but worldwide, and to engage with these big social questions, not to retreat into the internal issues of the church, but to engage with what was happening more broadly. He said that the message of Mater Magistra had not been received. And E. Hales wrote, the historian Hales, E. Hales wrote in his wonderful book, Pope John and His Revolution in 1965, some of you may remember it. He wrote this: the entire body of papal social teaching since the time of the First Vatican Council had been ignored, both in the planning and at the first session of the council. So they produced these documents without any attempt to really bring together all that was happening. So it looked at this stage that the council might fail. And just, it's interesting to look back at this period because there's so much happening. And suddenly what happens is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And world attention focuses on this fearful conflict between Russia and the United States with the prospect of a nuclear war. Reconnaissance photos on 15th of October proved that Soviet missiles were in Cuba and only minutes away from striking US cities. October the 20th, President Kennedy announced a naval blockade to prevent the Soviet ships with new missiles reaching Cuba. And I don't know if any of you remember that the world hit its breath at this dangerous time, the most dangerous point of the whole Cold War, and we prayed for a resolution. Now, it's been very little acknowledged in the standard literature of this period, but Hebblethwaite points out that John the 23rd was involved in the attempts to provide a resolution of this crisis. President Kennedy on 23rd of October called Norman Cousins, a man called Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Review, asking for a way to make contact with the Vatican. You know, they didn't have diplomatic relationships with the Vatican at that time. Who was he? How could he get to the Pope? Why did he ask Cousins? It was because Cousins had published a book in 1945 called Modern Man is Obsolete, arguing about the threat from nuclear weapons. And he said in that book that the only third force in a bipolar world was the papacy. Strange thing to say. Now, Cousins at this time was at a conference in Andover, Massachusetts, where there were also some Russian authors and scientists. And as well as at the conference, there was an eccentric Belgian Dominican priest, Father Felix Morlion, M-O-R-L-I-O-N, Morlion. And Cousins persuaded the Russians, who knew Khrushchev personally, they weren't just nobodies, to talk with Morlion, suggesting that the Pope could send a mollifying message to Moscow. Morlion had been kicked out of Rome by Cardinal Pizarro in 1960 and was, Peter Hebblethwaite writes, he was widely regarded as a CIA agent. But through his contacts in Rome, he was able to talk to Monsignor Igino Cardinale, who was the chief of protocol, who said that the Pope would help in any way he could. And that very night, the Pope worked on a statement, which he read the next morning at the end of his weekly audience on 24th of October. And this provided a signal to the Soviets. And it was the final sentence was read this: the Pope always speaks well of those statesmen on whatever side who strive to come together to avoid war and bring peace to humanity. That's it. That's the signal. And he sent another message, which he had hand-delivered to the Soviet embassy in Rome, begging leaders to negotiate and avoid the appalling consequences of war. And he said in this, history will see this loyal and open attitude as a witness to conscience, to promote, encourage, and accept negotiations, always and on every level, is a rule of wisdom that draws down heavenly blessings. John broadcast it on Vatican Radio the same afternoon. And on 26th of October, just 2 days later, the Soviet newspaper Pravda ran it on page 1 under the heading, "We beg all rulers not to be deaf to the cry of humanity." And Hebblethwaite writes that this gave Khrushchev room then to be, his own people and particularly his military leaders, to be seen to be responding to this man of peace as a way to draw back from this crisis. So Khrushchev on 28th of October, another 2 days later, replied to President Kennedy that he had suspended the missile bases and the Russian ships with their weapons, were turning back from the course to Cuba. Kennedy sent a telegram with his thanks to the Pope. And Khrushchev later told Cousins, "What the Pope has done for peace will go down in history." On December 19th, Cousins delivered a personal message to the Pope from Khrushchev, appreciative of his efforts in favour of peace, well-being and prosperity for all humanity. And John replied warmly. What does this tell us? It tells us how important these personal relationships can be in certain circumstances. Obviously, Khrushchev had he didn't have a good reputation. He'd been a very hard man in his earlier life and done some horrible things. But here he was at this stage of his life, had developed more conscience and wisdom, and was keen to establish some relationship with President Kennedy and his brother Robert. And so this was gave them a way out for him. So this is part of all the background to Pacem and Terris. All this is going on at the same time. So you can see that it's very tense period, but it's all very condensed. So John is determined now to go ahead with this encyclical on peace, both to broaden the sense of mission in the church, what the church was all about, and particularly with social justice, peace particularly. And he knew at this stage that he had cancer and his health was declining. On 29th of November 1962, the Vatican paper disclosed that the Pope had some serious health issues, but didn't mention the word cancer. So this gave John a renewed sense of urgency. And he asked Pietro Pavan, our man we've been talking about, then aged 58, to head a small team to draft the encyclical. He instructed Pavan that there was to be no condemnations of communism or of any different groups. There was to be encouragement to dialogue across all political and religious and ideological barriers. Well, Pavan was the right man to ask. He had been, he was, as you know, a prominent social activist and academic. He had helped write the Camaldoli Code, and some of you of Italian background would recognize this. It became the founding document of the Christian Democrats in Italy in 1943. And it articulated the principles for democracy and relationships with the church. It was comprised over about a week. Some 50 people from various Catholic social networks participated, including some of these names that you'll be familiar with. Giorgio Lapira, who is now been a social activist, has now been declared venerable by Pope Francis. The Christian Democrat leaders Aldo Moro, Paul VI's close friend, who was assassinated by the Red Brigade, you might remember. Giulio Andreotti, who was later Prime Minister as well, and Giuseppe Medici, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, another famous Italian politician. All these Christian Democratic leaders who, and it was finally presented, this is 1943, just after the collapse of the fascists, and it was Pavan who brought them all together and presented the document. And what do you think it said? 8 principles that you recognize immediately, the basis for modern Catholic social teaching: the dignity of the human person, which demands freedom of the individual, also in the economic field; equality of personal rights, in spite of profound individual differences; solidarity, the duty to cooperate to achieve the common good in society; recognition that the primary destination of material goods is for the benefit of everyone, of all. The possibility of appropriation of wealth, goods in the various legitimate ways by the state, presumably for the common good. Nationalisation, perhaps, in certain circumstances. Free trade of goods, in keeping commutative justice, exchange justice, commercial justice. Respect for the demands of exchange justice in remuneration for work. What do we mean? That means fair wages, just distribution of wealth. And respect for distributive and legal justice in the intervention of the state. So the state has a role too. And it said, as long as there are members in the society who lack necessities, it is the fundamental duty of society, including state and private organisations, church religious social organisations, including to come to their aid, including restriction of the property of unnecessary goods. So being able to redistribute wealth and property if need be. From 1945, Pacem had collaborated with the Catholic Institute for Social Activity and became the secretary and vice president of the social weeks of Italian Catholics, with very important weeks of debate and advocacy. Now, this is very interesting. For some years after the Second World War, Pacem lived in the same apartment building as Alcide, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Alcide de Gasperi, the Christian Democratic leader. The statesman served mass for him every morning and often stayed on to discuss matters of common interest. During these years, there were also frequent meetings on the subject of European integration, where he could exchange views with Adenauer, with Schuman and others. Let me explain. Richard Schuman was a leader of the Christian Democrats in France, becoming Minister of Finance in 1946, Prime Minister from 1947-48. He is regarded as a key founder of the European Union, from when he announced the Schuman Declaration in Paris in 1950, beginning the process of joint industrial production with Germany as a step toward a European federation. So very significant, you know, Pacem is right at the center with these groups. Konrad Adenauer was the leader of the Christian Democrats in Germany, became first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 to 1963. De Gasperi, the founder of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, and Prime Minister of Italy in successive governments from 1945 to 1953. It is this group of men, some of these, their causes for canonization or have been introduced because they were men of great religious conviction, but also of determination about the reconciliation of religion with democracy and human rights, and building on that and rebuilding Europe out of the horror of the Second World War. 1952, Pacem published his book, Christianity and Democracy, and again inspired by Jacques Maritain's writing about the compatibility between them. In 1953, he was appointed to the Ecclesiastical Commission of the Permanent Committee, this is a mouthful, for the International Congresses of the Lay Apostolate, where Rosemary Goldie was working. And they continued, they were very important at the Uganda meeting of the International Conference in 1953 and in Manila in the Philippines, 1955. So this is a critical position. This is the man, and Rosemary Goldie with him, of course, coordinating the development of the Catholic action movements throughout the world, actually. So, including the YCW movements, of course, this is part of this, part of the story. So that basically is what I wanted to bring to your attention. I'm not going to give you an outline of what was in the Pacem and Terris, because I think you're all familiar with it. The defense of human rights. Contrast this with Pius XII, not even mentioning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here is John the 23rd, bringing it all into the heart of Catholic social teaching, all the different rights that we're familiar with, and insisting on the, I just can't find my document here, but I'll find it in a sec, insisting on the right of lay people to make their own decisions in the political sphere, inspired, of course, by Catholic social teaching, but not acting on the orders or at the direction of the clergy, of the higher clergy. So this is a very important moment in the whole history of the church. And it had impacts here in Australia too, of course, because this was at the heart of the dispute about the movement, the Santa Maria movement, which had been at the forefront of the fight against communism, which was a very noble and honourable fight at that time, because it looked such a threat to Australian democracy in the future. The tragedy of it was that it overstepped its goals and tried to. Bob Santamaria tried to make it more than just a defence of the church and the nation against communism, but to take leadership and control of the Labor Party and then take a position of government. And of course, some of the bishops were not happy with this, went to Rome, and it went to Cardinal Gilroy, and some of the other bishops took this to Rome. Rosemary Goldie was helping them to move around to the different meetings that they had with various cardinals, and it wasn't exactly a trial that was held, but there was a hearing in which Cardinal, I think he was still father at the time, Pacem, was advocating that it was illegitimate for the movement to demand Catholics follow a particular political line in the name of the church. And against his position was the famous Jesuit priest, very vehement anti-communist Father Massaneo. But the hearing, the decision of the cardinals was entirely in favour of Pacem, and that was in 1957. Just forget at the moment. So we have a direct link with this, and I think looking back, I think Bob Santamaria was a bit misled by some of the advice he was getting at the time from the clergy here, perhaps, and his reading and understanding of Italian politics, that he thought the hardline position of the strong anti-communists in Rome was also applicable here in Australia. Well, as the Vatican decided, it was not. So it was entirely appropriate for the movement to continue on its own way, independently of a church, but not to act in the name of a church. It could support the church and Christian values in various ways that were appropriate, but not to speak and act as agents of a church. So perhaps that's enough from me. the questions, the parallels with what's happening there with the risk of war at the moment, and the lessons that might be learned. And I'm sure the people in Rome now are very well aware of the history behind John the 23rd's engagement with Khrushchev at that time, and have been thinking, well, what can we learn from this? Can we be a force for reconciliation and avoiding a conflict in Ukraine? It's become immensely complicated, of course, because it's very different from the Cuba situation. Ukraine has been invaded by the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of people on both sides have been killed and injured, and there's no immediate outcome. The initial hopes of Putin that it would have a quick victory and that would all be over and done and dusted have not turned out. And there's a prospect of, if he were to lose the war badly, he might resort to tactical nuclear weapons, which is a real nightmare for Europe and for the world, of course. So we're also at a very difficult and challenging moment. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for that wonderful tour de force of the context in which Pacem in Terris was thought up and actually written, not only by John the 23rd, with his background, his experience of war and social action, but also Pietro Pavan, who, yes, it's very interesting to see what he contributed as well, and also the change that you referred to between, let's say, the more conservative old way of doing things with the church controlling everything, or at least the hierarchy endeavouring to control things, and the new way of doing things, providing autonomy or recognising the autonomy of lay people to play their own role in bringing the kingdom. So now is the opportunity for everybody, actually. I don't know, Tony, you might have seen in the chat, Tony's going to help us, Tony Robertson, our facilitator. I'm not sure if there's any questions or comments in the chat that people would like to bring up already. But
well, Stefan, Stefan, we might invite Charles Roux. Charles has been popping a few comments as we've been progressing, and great reference back to the meeting in the Philippines with those great names, Cyril Halley and Roger Pryke, and also a bit of a question to Bruce. So, Charles, would you like to perhaps respond to what Bruce has delivered? We can't hear you, Charles. Maybe a technical hitch. Okay, then we'll come back. Raymond made a point that Pavan was also instrumental in that fantastic sentence from Justice in the World about action on behalf of justice as a constitutive part of the preaching of the gospel. Raymond, would you like to make a response to what Bruce has presented?
Well, that is my response. Pavan, as Bruce has outlined, was extremely well connected, and John the 23rd relied on him. But I think this sentence is it's a rather extraordinary sentence, and I think that it needs to be lifted up again and again. That document, Justice in the World, which came from the world's bishops, it's been lost sight of, and sometimes you don't find it even on websites where you'd expect. It's a rather radical statement, that action on behalf of justice, that, it's not enough to read out the gospel, that action is essential and constitutive to what we understand by the preaching of the gospel. So, I don't know, would Bruce like to comment on that?
Yes. Look, thank you very much, Raymond. That very interesting comment. I entirely agree with you. I think it's been lost in a lot of the commentary. It was a very important document, came out, and it got a lot of attention from in Catholic circles. It became a sort of motif for us, didn't it, at time? I think Francis has recovered it in other ways. I think I can't remember if he actually, I'm sure he does use it from time to time. He certainly thoroughly agrees and says repeatedly about how action for justice is an essential part of the gospel. And in many of his documents and speeches to international audiences, he uses that language. So yes, but I think we are, in the Australian church anyway, still a bit at sea on this. I don't know why, but I was thinking during the plenary council, the discussions that came out of that, there was very little attention to the global social justice issues. And even, I would say, we were very much focused on, except for climate change and Indigenous issues, particularly important, which are big enough in themselves. But I think like Laudato Si is not just about climate change, it's about inequality in Australia and globally, and the urgency of doing something about this, saying, as the economists and scientists kept saying, it doesn't have to be like this. There are, particularly since the COVID and so on, we know that there are 1 billion people suffering from hunger, and many others suffering from malnutrition of various sort of deficiency in vitamins and so on. So, and it doesn't have to be like this. We have the resources to fix this, but because the division in wealth has become so extreme, we're not using it in the right way. And at the heart of all this is the neoliberal ideology, which says business is about making money, and money has become, the idol of our culture, making money. And we have Stiglitz and Sachs and other people are saying a handful of people have astonishing amounts of, like, I forget the exact number, have $1 trillion in wealth, and just a fraction of that could help alleviate much of the poverty. We can do much better than this. I'm not sure how in Australia we can address this and whether we have the resources to. And I think my underlying concern is, I think that the social justice movements are fragmenting. But so I'm very pleased to see so many here today, and particularly those of you who have YCW background and a strong social conscience. I'm worried that what happens in the next generation.
Bruce, if I could throw something in, this is the anniversary of Pacem and Terris. I've hardly seen anything in any Catholic media celebrating, acknowledging this anniversary. And given the history of encyclicals, was it overwhelmed by Humanae Vitae just a few years later? And do you think, has it been lost in general ecclesial conversation?
I suppose yes. Certainly Humanae Vitae did overwhelm it because it touched people personally in a very intimate way, and very important issues in their life. And I think Pacem and Terris was a bit more remote from most people's lives. At that time, capitalism seemed to be doing okay. We weren't in that current predicament with such extremes between the very wealthy and most of the people. You know, just saying for 60 years, the wages of the ordinary people, working class males, have not increased in the United States in that time, allowing for inflation. So, this is an extraordinary situation to have developed when some are so absolutely wealthy beyond any other people in history, and with so many others quite impoverished. So I think at that time we were far more optimistic. We had much better sense of we were moving forward, we're becoming more progressive as a country and the world. Wealth was being more equitably distributed. The prospects were looking good, that the future looked bright. I think now doesn't look so bright. It's more challenging and more threatening because the climate change is upon us. The inequality is wreaking its havoc. It's undermining democracies in the United States. We're seeing countries all around. Pope Francis called it the Third World War being fought piecemeal, here, there, and everywhere. Yemen, Syria, other countries in Africa falling apart with climate change. Vast numbers of people fleeing their countries or migrating or trying to. Perhaps 100 million internally or externally displaced. So this is an astonishing situation. We have a whole new range of problems that we hadn't had on this scale before. So we need to be smart about it. And I guess that's what Francis is keeping drawing us back to with all his documents. And I presume he's working on another one now.
Can I just jump in there, Bruce? Because, actually it reminds me of something that I stumbled across when I was doing my PhD thesis on the role of Joseph Cardine at Vatican II. And that is the mention in Pacem and Terris of the phrase signs of the times. So it was the first time that that expression had come into the encyclical. And interestingly, that expression is not in the Latin version, but it's in the French and the English, I'm not sure other languages. So it was pretty much a last minute thing. Obviously, they chucked it in. And I think that was very much put there in the context of Schema 13, when they were starting on the drafting of Gaudium and Spes. They wanted to give themselves a theological justification for starting with the problems of the world. So, I just wanted to sort of throw that in. I can't remember myself who actually put it in. It probably was Pavan put in the signs of the times reference there. But I think that's very important also in today's context of the synod coming up, that we don't forget that whole approach of beginning with the reality the world's experiencing and all the problems you've just adverted to, which ought to be at the front of our minds as well. Yeah, if you've got any comment on that.
Yes, I certainly do. And I think Pope Francis picked that up very much in saying that signs of the times, the Holy Spirit is talking to us. The Spirit is talking to us, trying to say something to us. Not just he says the Spirit doesn't just work in the church. The Holy Spirit is working everywhere, all around us, in the events around us, in the cultural movements, in the intellectual and all the different spheres, in the people we meet. even people who are who never heard of Christianity, people of other religions or of no religion at all, even professed atheists. The Holy Spirit is still in their hearts and minds, and trying to say something. So Pope Francis, he keeps. I'm struck by how similar Francis is to what is on the 23rd was talking about with his dialogue and listening to people, getting to know people. And I'm sorry, that was just the phone. And he said, we have something to learn from everyone if we're open to it. So it's a matter, a discipline, this he talks about the discernment, very traditionally among Jesuits, of course, but it's also with all Christians practice discernment in various forms, and we all do this. So it's a matter of being attentive and somehow how you do it. It's not so easy, but so we won't go into that. But I think this is a new thing that we're seeing, and I think Cardinal Tsoni and he said in a recent book, we have to learn to see the Spirit, listen to the Spirit speaking to us through the world, not just through the church.
Great. Yeah, Tony, do you see any more questions coming from the audience? If you do, you can always put your yellow thing up there, but we've probably got to move towards a conclusion soon too, because we've been going nearly an hour and a half. So is there anybody else who'd like to be the last or the second last commenter or questioner?
Well, Bruce, Charles had asked that because that tension between the ideology with action and programs as against dictatorial practice, which was the model that the church confronted in communism. And we probably see it a bit played out in some of the pastoral stuff. Like, it's interesting to watch the way the Archbishop of Canberra is responding to the situation with Calvary Hospital, which rather than being a dialogue seems to be thriving on confrontation. And there might be others here who are a bit closer to that scenario. Have we really changed, Bruce, at the grassroots level? Has the spirit of John the 23rd filtered into the pews?
Are you asking me?
Yes. Oh, anybody else that wants to
yes.
throw in tuppence?
Somebody else might have more information on that than I do.
Yeah. It's just a model. Jim, did you want to say something?
I thought the spirit did penetrate for a while, and now it has dissipated, and Francis is saying, hey, we're missing something. And I find it just a real exciting challenge that there still is a generation that remembers the council and John the 23rd. But there's a huge gap.
Yeah, well, look, I think we probably better move to a conclusion. I don't see any other yellow hands up on the screen. And I think that actually is a good conclusion. There's a big gap there that we need to fill. So I think it's kind of a challenge that Bruce has laid out for us. And I think there's a lot more that we've got to do. Possibly we can discuss some more of these aspects in future webinars. But tonight, I'd just like to say thanks very much again to Bruce, who really, has also shown us the parallels between the approach of John the 23rd and Pope Francis. The phrase that comes to my mind is Pope Francis has enlarged the space of your tent, which is what John the 23rd was already doing 60, 70 years ago. So there's a lot more to be done, and it gives us a real inspiration and as well as some practical thoughts about challenges that the world is facing today. So thanks very much, Bruce, but also thanks to Tony and to everybody else who's joined us tonight. And we'll be back with another webinar next month. Thank you very much.